Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Shadow of War. What was Roosevelt's opinion on the London Conference? How did Roosevelt's every man for himself attitude further impact the economic crisis? So let's get started. Chapter Introduction. The epidemic of the world lawlessness is spreading. When an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in on a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease. There must be positive endeavors to preserve peace. Chicago, quarantine speech, 1937. How ironic regarding the events of this week. Americans in the 1930s tried to turn their backs on the world's problems. The president at first seemed to share these views. The only battle Roosevelt sought was war against the Depression. America had its own burdens to shoulder, and the cost in foreign involvement, whether in blood or treasure, simply seemed too great. But as the clouds of the war gathered over Europe, Roosevelt eventually concluded that the United States could no longer remain aloof. Events gradually brought the American people around to this thinking. No nation was safe in an era of international anarchy, and the world could not remain half enchained and half free. So in this page, it basically states Roosevelt first tried to ignore the world's problems, but eventually he became more involved in them because he realized that these issues are affecting America. The London Conference. The 66th Nation London Economic Conference, meeting in the summer of 1933, revealed how thoroughly Roosevelt's early foreign policy was subordinated to a strategy of domestic economic recovery. The delegates to the London Conference hoped to organize a coordinated international attacks on a global depression. They were particularly eager to stabilize the values of the various nations' currencies and the rates to which they could be exchanged. Exchange rate stabilization was essential to revival the world trade, which had all but evaporated by 1933. So this London Conference is important because they're talking about the economic issues, looking at the world. They look to stabilize currency rates. Roosevelt first agreed to send an American delegation to the conference, including Secretary of State Cordell Hull. But the president soon began to have second thoughts about the conference's agenda. He wanted to pursue his gold juggling and other inflationary policies at home as a means of stimulating American recovery. An international agreement to maintain the value of the dollar in terms of other currencies might tie his hands. And at bottom, Roosevelt was unwilling to sacrifice the possibility of domestic recovery for the sake of international cooperation. While vacationing on a yacht along the New England coast, he dashed off a radio message to London, scolding the conference for attempting to stabilize currencies and essentially declaring America's withdrawal from the negotiations. So one thing you understand is Roosevelt's very critical of this conference, specifically because he's more focused on the American economy rather than looking at the world economy. Roosevelt's bombshell announcement yanked the rug from under the London Conference. The delegates adjourned empty-handed and amid cries of American bad faith. Whether the conference could have arrested the worldwide economic slide is debatable. But Roosevelt's every man for himself attitude plunged the planet even deeper in an economic crisis. The collapse of the London Conference also strengthened the global trend towards extreme nationalism, making international cooperation ever more difficult as the dangerous decade of the 1930s unfolded. Reflecting the powerful persistence of American isolationism, Roosevelt's action played directly into the hands of the power-mad dictators who were determined to shatter the peace of the world. Americans themselves would eventually pay a high price for the narrow-minded belief that the United States could go get alone in the modern world. So all in all, one thing you understand here is that Roosevelt, of course, he doesn't necessarily agree with the London Conference. As a result of this, America is highly criticized, and this leads to, it actually favors the rise of dictatorships during this time frame because more nations became nationalistic, focusing on their own needs rather than the global market. And I did answer question number 1 on your GRQ, so go back and take a look at that. 33.2, freedom from the Filipinos and recognition of the Russians. What was FDR's good neighbor policy? Define reciprocity. For the sake of time, I'm actually going to skip through this section. Becoming a good neighbor. Closer to home, Roosevelt inaugurated a refreshing new era in relations with Latin America. He proclaimed in his inaugural address, "I'll dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor." Taken together, Roosevelt's non-involvement in Europe and withdrawal from Asia, along with his brotherly embrace of his New World neighbors, suggested that the United States was giving up its ambition to be a world power and would content itself with being merely a regional power. Its interests and activities continued exclusively to the Western Hemisphere. Old-fashioned intervention by bayonet in the Caribbean had not paid off, except in an evil harvest of resentment, suspicion, and fear. The Great Depression had cooled off Yankee economic aggressiveness, as thousands of investors in Latin American securities became sackholders rather than stockholders. There were now fewer dollars to be protected by the rifles of the hated Marines. So during the Great Depression, of course, interventionist America, or not interventionist, I'm sorry, when you're looking at aggression by the United States military in Latin America, would kind of come to a halt. With war-thirsty dictators seizing power in Europe and Asia, Roosevelt was eager to line up the Latin Americas to help defend the Western Hemisphere. Bitter neighbors would be potential tools of transoceanic aggressors. President Roosevelt made clear at the outset that he was going to renounce armed intervention, particularly the vexatious corollary to the Monroe Doctrine devised by his cousin Theodore Roosevelt. Late in 1933, at the 7th Pan-American Conference in Montevideo, Uruguay, the U.S. delegation formally endorsed non-intervention. So one thing you understand about here is that Roosevelt's trying to better his relationship with Latin America, specifically because he's concerned about the dictatorships in Europe trying to spread their influence and obtain territory here. Deeds follow words. The last Marines departed from Haiti in 1934. The same year after a strongman, Fulgencio Batista, had come to power, rest of Cuba was released from the worst hobbles of the Platt Amendment, under which America had been free to intervene, although the United States retained its naval base at Guantanamo. The tiny country of Panama received a similar uplift in 1936 when Washington partially relaxed its grip on the Isthmus nation. So what you're getting here is, of course, FDR is trying to better his relations with the Latin American countries by withdrawing a lot of the military troops. This is evident in Cuba, with exception Guantanamo Bay, Panama, as well as Haiti. The hope-inspiring good neighbor policy, with the essence of consultation and non-intervention, received its acid test in Mexico when the Mexican government seized Yankee oil properties in 1938. American investors vehemently demanded armed intervention to repossess their confiscated businesses, but Roosevelt successfully resisted the badgering, and the settlement was finally threshed out in 1941, even though the oil companies lost much of their original stake. So this is good neighbor policy. The good neighbor policy, as stated, is a departure from the Roosevelt Colliery to the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, Roosevelt Colliery went ahead and said that the United States is going to pay off all the debts for the West in terms of making sure that Europe stays out. Well, the Monroe Doctrine is now transitioning back to this, where the Latin American nations would be given their sovereignty, free from Europe, as well as, I guess you could say, American intervention. This is evident, and the biggest test of this was in Mexico when you're getting the Yankee oil properties are being seized, and Roosevelt chooses not to intervene. Spectacular success crowned Roosevelt's good neighbor policy. His earnest attempts to usher in a new era of friendliness, though hurting some U.S. bondholders, paid rich dividends and goodwill among the people of the South. No other citizen in the United States has ever been held in such high esteem in Latin America during his lifetime. Roosevelt was cheered in tumultuous enthusiasm when, as a traveling salesman for peace, he journeyed to the special Inter-American Conference in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in 1936. The Colossus of the North now seemed less a vulture and more an eagle. So this is definitely, if you're looking at continuity and change, this is definitely a change, with the exception of Guantanamo Bay, as the United States under Roosevelt are now trying to better their relations with Latin America. Remember, this is different from World War I, because in World War I, of course, the relations with Mexico and Latin America were definitely on the downturn. What was FDR's good neighbor policy? of course, bettering um, relations with Latin American countries by taking their military out. And the reason for this was because of uh, fear of fascism, fear of fascist influence from Western, just from Europe. Right? Define reciprocity. I'll have you look that one up on your own. Uh, let's go ahead and tell me what the RTAA was and why was the RTAA considered a landmark piece of legislation. Secretary Hall's reciprocal trade agreements. Okay. Secretary Hall's reciprocal trade agreements. Intimately associated with good neighborism and also popular in Latin America was the reciprocal trade policy of the New Dealers. Its chief architect was idealistic Secretary of State Hall, a high-minded Tennessean of the low tariff school. Like Roosevelt, he believed the trade was a two-way street, that a nation can sell abroad only as it buys abroad. The tariff barriers broke off the foreign trade, and the trade wars begat shooting wars. Responding to the Hall Roosevelt leadership, Congress passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreement. So, what reciprocal means is that what one nation gets, the other nation will get in return. The Reciprocal Trade Agreement in 1934. It was the act that reversed traditional high protective tariffs by allowing the president to negotiate lower tariffs with trade partners without Senate approval. So remember, prior to this, America had some of its highest tariffs. So this allows the president the powers to go ahead and negotiate this without Congress. Designed in part to lift the American export trade from depression doldrums, this enlightened measure was aimed at both relief and recovery. At the same time, it activated the low tariff policies of the New Dealers. The Reciprocal Trade Agreement avoided the dangerous uncertainties of a wholesale tariff revision. It merely whittled down the most objectionable schedules of the Hawley-Smoot Law by amending them. Roosevelt was empowered to lower rates by as much as 50%, providing that the other country was willing to respond with similar reductions. The resulting pacts, moreover, were to become more effective with the formal approval of the Senate. This novel feature was not only ensured speedy reaction, but sidestepped the twin evils of high stakes, log rolling, and high pressure lobbying in Congress. So this gave the president the power to negotiate tariffs. More specifically, what he wanted to do was lower the Hawley-Smoot Law, remember, which was taxing some nations 60% for a tariff. And Roosevelt wanted to lower this, but in return, those other nations would have to lower their tariff as well. This was beneficial because one of the things that it would do, it would stimulate economic trade, foreign trade with nations, thus stabilizing the economy. Secretary Hull, whose zeal for reciprocity was unflagging, succeeded in negotiating pacts with 21 countries by the end of 1939. During these same years, U.S. foreign trade increased appreciably, presumably in part as a result of the Hull-Roosevelt policies. Trade agreements undoubtedly bettered economic and political relations with Latin America and proved to be an influence for peace in a war-bent world. So lowering these tariffs definitely provided peace with Latin America. The Reciprocal Trade Agreements was a landmark piece of legislation. It reversed the traditional high protective tariff policy that persisted among broken Civil War days, and it so damaged the American and international economies following World War I. It also paved the way for the American-led free international economic system that took shape after World War II, a period that witnessed the most robust growth in American international trade. Robust growth in the history of international trade. So as you can see here, the reciprocal trade agreements, they were very successful because by lowering these tariffs, it would allow the economy to grow in the United States, but more importantly, it also promoted some world peace during this time of extreme warfare amongst nations. Right? As you can see, my dogs agree. So I definitely went ahead, discussed that. What was RTAA? Reciprocal Trade Agreement, lowering tariff. In exchange, the other nation would have to reciprocate and lower their tariff as well. It promoted world peace, but it also helped revise some of the foreign trade, which would also kind of boost the economy. Storm-Cellar Isolationism. Describe the philosophies of each leader. Mussolini, Franco, and Hitler. What was the Rome-Berlin Axis? Japan's termination of the Washington Naval Treaty. Italians' attack on Ethiopia. So here we are going to talk about the rise of fascism. Post-1918 chaos in Europe, followed by the Great Depression, spawned the ominous spread of totalitarianism. The individual was nothing. The state was everything. The communist USSR led the way, with the crafty and ruthless Joseph Stalin finally emerging as dictator. In 1936, he began to purge his communist state of all suspected dissidents, ultimately executing hundreds of thousands and banishing millions to remote Siberian forced labor camps. Blustery Benito Mussolini, a swaggering fascist, seized the reins of power in Italy during 22, and Adolf Hitler, a fanatic with a toothbrush mustache, plotted and harangued his way to the control of Germany in 33 with his liberal use of the big lie. So Mussolini, of course, dictator of Italy, he's able to obtain power after the Great Depression. You're also getting Adolf Hitler, of course, leader of the Nazi Party. By 1933, the Weimar Republic has fallen apart, and they have gained power. Hitler was the most dangerous of the dictators because he combined tremendous power with impulsiveness. A frustrated Austrian painter with hypnotic talents as an orator and leader, he had secured control of the Nazi Party by making political capital of the Treaty of Versailles, and Germany's depression spawned unemployment. He was thus a misbegotten child of short-sighted post-war policies of the victorious Allies, including the United States. The desperate German people had fallen behind the new Pied Piper, for they saw no other hope of escape from the plague of economic chaos and national disgrace. Hitler withdrew Germany from the League of Nations in 1933 and began clandestinely and illegally rearming. In 1936, the Nazi Hitler and the fascist Mussolini aligned themselves with the Rome-Berlin axis. Hitler was able to gain power specifically because of the Great Depression. A lot of Germans weren't necessarily happy with the Weimar Republic, and some of the reasons why was because of the economic depression, as stated in the last chapter. Italy at this time is also turned into a fascist state, and both Hitler and Mussolini begin to rearm themselves. Italy could rearm themselves, but Germany begins illegally rearming themselves and breaking the Treaty of Versailles and forming the Rome-Berlin axis. Yep. International gangsterism was likely spreading in the Far East, where Imperial Japan was on the make. Like Germany and Italy, Japan was so-called have not power. Like them, it resented ungenerous the Treaty of Versailles. Like them, it demanded additional space for its teeming millions, cooped up in a crowded island nation. Japanese navalists were not to be denied. Determined to find a place in the Asiatic sun, Tokyo gave notice in 1934 of the termination of the 12-year-old Washington Naval Treaty. A year later at London, the Japanese torpedoed all hope of effective naval disarmament. Upon being denied complete parity, they walked out of the multi-power conference and accelerated the construction of giant battleships. By 1935, Japan too had quit the League of Nations. 5 years later, it joined the arms of Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact. So Japan, obviously being landlocked, they lack resources. They feel the need to expand. They're not happy with the Treaty of Versailles. They often felt as if they're being stepped on by European nations. They withdraw from the Washington Naval Treaty, which, remember, limited the amount of large Navy ships that nations could have. And remember, they also invade Manchuria. So looking at these, they violate these post-World War I treaties, and they form an alliance or a pact with Germany and Italy. Jawed Mussolini, nice description, seeking both glory and empire in Africa, brutally attacked Ethiopia in 1935 with bombers and tanks. The brave defenders, armed with spears and ancient firearms, were speedily crushed. Members of the League of Nations could have caused Mussolini's war machine to creak it to a halt if they had only dared to embargo oil. But when the League quailed rather than risk global hostilities, it merely signed its own death warrant. So Mussolini attacks Italy, and the League of Nations is not able to do anything to prevent this from happening. Isolationism, long festering in America, received a strong boost from these alarms abroad. Though disapproving of the dictators, America still believed that their encircling seas conferred to a mystic immunity. They were continuing to suffer disillusion born of their participation in World War I, which they now regarded as a colossal blunder. They likewise nursed bitter memories of ungrateful and defaulting debtors. As early as 1934, the spiteful Congress passed the Johnson Debt Default Act, which prevented debt-dodging nations from borrowing further in the United States. If attacked again by aggressors, these delinquents could not stew in their own juices. So what the Johnson Debt Act basically says, this looked at the ugly memories of World War I. The Spiteful Act prevented debt-ridden nations from borrowing further from the United States. So think about those nations, France, Great Britain, that have such a large amount of debt that they owe to the United States because of the war economy, borrowing from the United States. The United States is saying that those nations, if they get into war, cannot borrow and dig themselves further into debt. Mired down in the Great Depression, Americans had no real appreciation of the revolutionary forces being harassed by the dictators. The have-not powers were out to become have powers. Americans were not so much afraid that totalitarian aggression could cause trouble as they were fearful that they might be drawn into it. Strong nationwide sentiment welled up for a constitutional amendment to forbid declaration of war by Congress, except in case of invasion, unless there was a favorable popular referendum. With a mixture of seriousness and frivolity, a group of Princeton University students began to agitate in 1936 for a bonus to be paid for the veterans of future wars, while the prospective frontliners were still alive. So Americans, in short, did not want to go to war. They still felt haunted by World War I. Right? So I did define all, or most of these. We'll talk about Franco in a second. Fascist, fascist, fascist. Alliance between Rome and Berlin. Japan decides to build up their military arms and violates this treaty because they needed economic resources. Italy attacks Ethiopia. Ethiopia is able to defeat Italy in World War I, and Italy kind of wants their revenge. But this shows the League of Nations as powerless. All these things kind of brought memories back of World War I, right? And this kind of just looked at how, of course, during World War I, it was more of a blunder than anything else. It brought up the issues of if these nations were to go to war, it's imperative that the United States not loan out money because, remember, they weren't given any money back. Congress legislates neutrality. As the gloomy 1930s lengthened, an avalanche of lurid articles and books condemning the munitions factors as war fomenting merchants of death poured from American presses. A Senate committee headed by Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota was appointed in 1934 to investigate the blood business. By sensationalizing evidence regarding America's entry into World War I, the senatorial probers tended to shift the blame away from German submarines and onto American bankers and arms manufacturers. Because the munitions makers had obviously made money out of the war, many naive citizen leaped to the logical conclusion that these soulless scavengers had caused the war in order to make money. This kind of reasoning suggested that the profits could only be removed from the arms trafficked. One hell of a business. The country could steer clear of any world conflict that might erupt in the future. So what this committee is looking at, the Senate committee, basically did some research and they found out that one of the main reasons for us entering World War I was specifically because of the dealing of arms. That you're getting these businessmen, these bankers and arm manufacturers, that they're sending these resources over to those nations in war. And as a result of this, it gets us into the war. It gets us involved in the war because those ships are being sunk by the U-boats, German U-boats. Some conspirators would even go far to say is that they started the war, that they felt that this would be beneficial to them. So therefore, it was worth the lives. Responding to the overwhelming popular pressure, Congress made haste to legislate the nation on war. Action was spurred by the danger that Mussolini's Ethiopian assault would plunge the world into a new bloodbath. So the Neutrality Acts of 35, 36, and 37, they're taken together, stipulated that when the president proclaimed the existence of a foreign war, certain restrictions could automatically go into effect. No American could legally sail a belligerent ship, sell or transport munitions to a belligerent, or make loans to a belligerent. So these Neutrality Acts are very important. They're basically acts that are trying to keep America out of World War II, and they do this by declaring neutrality, but also limiting and setting strict restrictions on sailing on a belligerent ship. So what that means is being on a ship of someone that's in war, selling or transporting munitions to a belligerent. So selling to someone or transporting weapons to someone that is in war, or making loans, providing money to someone that's in war. This head in the sand legislation marked an abandonment of the traditional policy of freedom of the seas, a policy for which America had professedly fought two full-fledged wars and several undeclared wars. The Neutrality Acts were specifically tailored to keep the nation out of conflict like World War I, and they had been in effect at that time. America probably would not have been sucked in, at least not in April of 1917. Congress was one war too late with this legislation. What seemed dishonorable to Wilson seemed honorable and desirable to later disillusioned generation. So you could kind of see here is this change. While shipping to belligerent nations did happen in World War I, this would be a change in World War II. In the beginning stages, they wanted to be neutral. And to keep that neutrality, trade and power of the seas was very much limited. America dooms Loyalist Spain. Francisco Franco is what we'll get here. The Spanish Civil War of 36 to 39, a proving ground and dress rehearsal in Mission for World War II, was a painful object lesson in the folly of neutrality by legislation. Spanish rebels who rose against the left-leaning Republican government in Madrid were headed by fascistic general Francisco Franco, generally aided by his fellow conspirators, Hitler's and Mussolini. He undertook to overthrow the established Loyalist regime, which in turn was assisted on a smaller scale by the Soviet Union. The pipeline from communist Moscow chilled the natural sympathies of many Americans, especially Roman Catholics, for the Republican Loyalists. But after Americans burned their passion to defend the struggling republic against Franco's fascist coup, some 3,000 men and women headed to Spain to fight as volunteers in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. So, of course, in this war, you're getting Francisco Franco trying to overthrow the Loyalist Party. So he's getting support from Mussolini and Hitler, right? Because he is more of a fascist. On the other hand, the Soviet Union is helping more of the left Loyalist regime. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade, these are American fighters. America does not intervene in this war. However, they are sending, or there are volunteers that are wanting to go and fight and support Spain. Washington continued official relations with the Loyalist government. But Congress, with the encouragement of Roosevelt, and with only one dissenting vote, amended the existing neutrality legislation so as to apply an arms embargo to both Loyalists and rebels. Roosevelt remarked the dictator Franco behaved in the manner of a true gentleman. FDR regretted being so gentlemanly. Uncle Sam thus sat at the sidelines while Franco, abundantly supplied with arms and men by his fellow dictators, strangled the Republican government of Spain. The democracies, including the United States, were so determined to stay out of the war that they helped to condemn a fellow democracy to death. In doing so, they further encouraged the dictators to take the dangerous road that led to the precipice of World War II. So what we end up getting here is because the United States declared the neutrality, you're getting fascist Mussolini and Hitler, Italy and Germany. They're supplying weapons to fascist Franco in Spain, which leads to the dictatorship of Franco becoming the ruler and taking out the Loyalist democracy. So you can kind of see here, this is a sign of American neutrality. Appeasing Germany and Japan. Sulphurous war clouds had meanwhile been gathering in the tension-taut Far East. In 1937, the Japanese militarists at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing, touched off explosion that led to an all-out invasion of China. In this sense, this attack was on the curtain riser of World War II. So we talked about this in class. We're getting the Manchurian incident where Japan blows up a bridge and they blame the Chinese for doing this, so then they declare war on them. Roosevelt shrewdly declined to invoke the recently passed neutrality legislation by refusing to call the China incident and officially declared war. If he had put the existing restrictions in effect, he would have to cut off the trickle of munitions on which the Chinese were desperately dependent. The Japanese, of course, could continue to buy mountainous war supplies in the United States. Um, so what we end up getting here is, remember, we still have trade with both the United States, but the United States and Japan. But the United States, although we passed the Neutrality Acts, we do not call this a war. The reason being is we want to be able to send weapons to China to help defend themselves against Japan. In Chicago, unofficial isolationist capital of America, President Roosevelt delivered his sensational quarantine speech in the autumn of 1937. Alarmed by the recent aggressions of Italy and Japan, he called for positive endeavors to quarantine the aggressors, presumably by economic embargo. So what this means is quarantine is in which he called to quarantine land-hungry dictators. That means block trade with them, right? Do not let them get resources, starve them to death as a result of that. The speech triggered a cyclone of protests from isolationists and other foes of involvement. They feared that a moral quarantine would lead to a shooting quarantine. Started by this angry response, Roosevelt retreated and sought less direct means to curb the dictators. So what they felt was this embargo in some ways might get us into war, right? America's isolationist mood intensified, especially in regard to China. In December 1937, Japanese aviators bombed and sank an American gunboat, the Panay, in Chinese water, with the loss of 2 killed and 30 wounded. In the days of 1898, when the Maine went down, this outrage might have provoked war. But after Tokyo hastened to make the necessary apologies and pay proper indemnity, Americans breathed a deep sigh of relief. Japanese militarists were thus encouraged to vent their anger against the superior white race by subjecting American civilians in China, both male and female, to humiliating slappings and strippings. So there were several instances where we could have gotten to war against Japan. The bombing of the Panay was the bombing of the Maine. However, Japan apologized, therefore we refrained from going to war. Adolf Hitler, meanwhile, grew bolder and bolder and bolder and louder in Europe. In 1935, he had openly flouted the Treaty of Versailles by introducing compulsory military service in Germany. The next year, he brazenly marched into the demilitarized German Rhineland, likewise contrary to the detested treaty. While Frank and Britain looked on in gloomy indecision, lashing his following to frenzy, Hitler undertook to persecute and then exterminate the Jewish population in the areas. Under his control, in the end, he wiped out about 6 million innocent victims, mostly in gas chambers. Following upon his people to sacrifice butter for guns, he whipped the new German Air Force and mechanized ground divisions into the most devastating military machine that the world has seen. So Hitler's obviously breaking the Treaty of Versailles, but Great Britain and France are obviously appeasing him. They're giving in to him. And this allows Hitler to create one of the largest militaries. Suddenly, in March 1938, Hitler bloodlessly occupied German-speaking Australia. Bloodlessly. I mean, remember, Treaty of Versailles stated that Germany and Austria cannot make an alliance. And Germany is able to occupy Austria with no pushback from, of course, the Austrians, but none from Great Britain and France as well. But like a drunken reveler, calling for madder music and stronger wine, Hitler could not stop. Intoxicated by his recent gains, he began bullying demands for a German-inhabited Sudetenland of neighboring Czechoslovakia. The leaders of France and Britain, eager to appease Hitler, sought frantically to bring the dispute to the conference table. President Roosevelt, also deeply alarmed, kept the wires hot with personal messages to both Hitler and Mussolini, urging a peace settlement. So in other words, we get the Czechoslovakian occupation, right? Hitler has obtained the Sudetenland, and now there's a conference called the Munich Conference, which looks to figure out what to do with Czechoslovakia. A conference was finally held in Munich, Germany in September of 1938. The Western European democracies, badly unprepared for war, betrayed Czechoslovakia to Germany when they consented to shearing away the Sudetenland. They hoped, and these hopes were shared by the American people, that the concessions at the conference table would slake Hitler's thirst for power and bring peace in our time. Indeed, Hitler publicly promised that the Sudetenland is his last territorial gain. I have to make in Europe. So they're giving Hitler this territory in hopes that he would, of course, stop his expansion. Well, Hitler claims he will, but that's not true at all. Appeasement of the dictators, symbolized by the ugly word Munich, turned Appeasement of the dictator, symbolized by the ugly word Munich, turned out to be merely a surrender of the installment plan. It was like giving a cannibal a finger in the hope of saving an arm. In March 1939, Hitler suddenly erased the rest of Czechoslovakia, because remember we gave him Sudetenland, and he said that he was done, but he would go ahead and take over Czechoslovakia. Later on, he would also invade Poland. So we will. So we talked about this a little bit. What did he do? Treaty. So yeah, let's go through this. Treaty of Versailles violations. He built up an army. That's a violation. He made alliance with Austria. That's a violation. What does it mean? He should be punished for it, but of course, Great Britain does nothing. Neither does France. Rhineland. Not allowed to occupy, send military there. He does it. What does it mean? He's violated the Treaty of Versailles. France, of course, and so does Great Britain. They absolutely do nothing. What do you do with Austria? He bloodlessly took over Austria. Is he allowed to do this? No. According to the Treaty of Versailles, Austria and Germany shall never formulate an alliance. Well, they do. What does Great Britain and France do? Obviously nothing. Sudetenland, area of Czechoslovakia, which has a very supportive Nazi. They support the Nazi Party. What did Hitler do? Occupies it. Meets at the Munich aggression. Meets at the Munich conference, the Great Britain and France. What do? They give him Sudetenland. However, he says that he will not obtain Czechoslovakia. What does he do? He later does. So appeasement. That's when you are giving into somebody. Giving into, I guess you could say a bully, but giving into something that you don't want to, just to avoid conflict during the time, but it leads to further conflict in the future. Non-aggression pact, that's going to be with Russia. Joseph Stalin, the Sphinx of the Kremlin, was a key to the peace puzzle. In the summer of 1939, the British and French were busily negotiating with Moscow, hopefully obscuring a mutual defense treaty that would halt Hitler. But mutual suspicions proved insuperable. The Soviet Union astounded by the world by signing on August 23 a non-aggression treaty with the German dictator. So, although Hitler and Stalin don't like each other, they do make a non-aggression pact, which means that they agree not to invade each other. The notorious Hitler-Stalin pact meant that the German leader now had a green light to make a war in Poland, into Western democracies, without fearing a stab in the back from the Soviet Union, his communist archfoe. Consternation struck with those wishful thinkers in Western Europe, who had finally hoped that Hitler might be sussed upon Stalin so that the twin menaces could bleed each other to death. It was as plain as the mustache of Stalin's face that the Willy Soviet dictator was plotting to turn his German accomplice against the Western democracies. The two warring camps would then kill each other off and leave Stalin striding a Europe-like colossus. So these two hate each other. What the United States was kind of hoping is that these two would go to war against each other. Hitler was very anti-communist. So the hope was that these two would bleed each other to death. While with the signing of the Nazi-Soviet pact, World War II was only 2 hours away. Hitler now demanded neighboring Poland in return for areas wrested from Germany after World War I. Failing to secure satisfaction, he sends mechanized divisions crashing into Poland. So by formulating an alliance with Russia, Hitler is able to attack Poland easily. Britain and France, honoring their commitments to Poland, promptly declared war. At last, they perceived the folly of continued appeasement, but they were powerless to aid Poland, which succumbed in 3 weeks to Hitler's smashing strategy terror, Blitzkrieg. Stalin, as prearranged secretly in his fatal pact with Hitler, came in on the killer for a share of the old Russian Poland. Long declared World War II was now fully launched, and the truce of 1939 had come to an end. Roosevelt, so of course, as a result of the non-aggression pact, they go ahead and invade. Hitler invades Poland. As a result of that, France and Great Britain will declare war on Germany. Roosevelt speedily issued routine proclamations of neutrality. Americans were overwhelmingly anti-Nazi and anti-Hitler. They fervently hoped that democracies would win, and they would finally believe that the forces of righteousness would triumph, as in 1918. but they were desperately determined to stay out. They were not going to be suckers again. Neutrality became a heated issue in the United States. Ill-prepared Britain and France urgently needed American airplanes and other weapons, but the Neutrality Act raised a sternly forbidden hand. Roosevelt summoned Congress in special session shortly after the invasion of Poland to consider lifting the arms embargo. After 6 weeks of debate, a makeshift law emerged. Act of 39, Neutrality Act of 39, provided that henceforth the European democracies might buy American war materials, but only on a cash and carry basis. So it's saying that these France and Great Britain could buy goods, however, it's cash and carry. This meant that they would have to transport the munitions on their own ships after paying for them in cash. America wanted to avoid loans, war debts, and the torpedo of American arms carriers. So this was a change with neutral policy. World War I, remember, they allowed trade. But now this cash and carry, Neutrality Act 1939 states that they could trade with Great Britain and France. However, it needs to be paid in cash, and they got to carry the stuff on their own boats. They didn't want to get hit by submarines. While Congress thus loosened former restrictions in response to interventionist crisis, it added others in response to isolationist fears. Roosevelt was now also authorized to proclaim danger zones in which American merchant ships would be forbidden to enter. This unneutral neutrality law unfortunately hurt China, which was effectively blockaded by Japanese Navy. But despite its effects, it clearly favored the European democracies against the dictators. As Britain and France navies controlled the Atlantic, European aggressors could not send their ships to buy American munitions. The United States not only improved its moral position, but simultaneously helped its economic position. Overseas demand for war goods brought a sharp upswing in the recession of 37-38 and ultimately solved a decade of long-term unemployment. So our neutrality, of course, helps stimulate the economy again because Great Britain and France are buying these goods from us. And also it's creating jobs, so it's solving some of the issues of the Great Depression.